A homeless man stopped JD Vance on the street, asking for just $1. What happened next left the entire crowd completely stunned. It was one of those afternoons in downtown Cincinnati where the sky threatened rain but never followed through, and the air carried the scent of damp pavement and fast food grease, a blend of the city's pulse and quiet neglect. Pedestrians moved with their usual rhythm, some with purpose, others lost in thought, and some, like JD Vance, caught somewhere in between. Walking at a steady pace with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, Vance blended into the city, dressed casually, yet still drawing subtle attention. A few people stole glances, whispering to each other. Some recognized him from TV, others from the headlines. His name carried weight, but at that moment, he was just another man passing a row of aging storefronts, dodging an abandoned scooter on the sidewalk. Then, cutting through the city noise, a voice called out from the side, "Hey man, can you spare $1?" It wasn't the first time Vance had heard those words. He'd spent enough time in places like this to recognize the familiar rhythm of street requests. Usually, it was a quick nod or a polite shake of the head, and life moved on. But something about this one, maybe the slight tremor in the man's voice or the way he avoided immediate eye contact, made Vance slow his step. The man was thin, but not just in the way hunger wears a person down. It was the kind of thin that hollows out the cheeks, making his eyes seem unnaturally large. His mismatched layers of clothing told the story of someone who dressed for survival, not style. His patchy beard looked more like neglect than choice, and his hands were cracked from constant exposure to the elements. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't insistent, just standing there, waiting, like he had asked this question 1,000 times before and expected nothing. Vance stopped. "What's your name?" The man blinked, caught off guard, as if that wasn't how this was supposed to go. Usually, people either dropped a bill into his palm or simply walked away. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Eddie," he muttered. Vance studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Around them, people walked past, barely noticing, just another brief exchange between a politician and a man most would ignore. But something about Eddie kept Vance rooted where he stood. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in the way he asked, not demanding, not performing, just asking. "You live around here, Eddie?" Vance asked. Eddie let out a short laugh, void of humor. "I live wherever I can. You know how it is." Vance nodded but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been out here?" Eddie shifted, glancing toward the street as if debating whether to keep talking or just walk away. "Too long," he finally said. Vance exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. He could feel eyes on him now. Someone had stopped nearby, maybe eavesdropping, maybe recording. He wasn't sure, and it didn't matter. But what he said next would. Eddie shifted again, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his oversized jacket, the fabric stiff and worn, its original color faded into something between brown and gray. His fingers curled inside the fabric, gripping nothing, as if the motion itself kept them warm. Vance studied him a moment longer. Most politicians would have already walked away or, at best, tossed a bill into his hand. A few dollars, that's what most people would have given before moving on. But Vance still didn't reach for his wallet. Eddie noticed, and for just a second, his expression flickered between expectation and disappointment, like he had already rehearsed this moment in his mind. "I just need $1, he said again, softer this time, as if lowering the price of his request might change the answer. Vance didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced down the street, where a small group of people had started watching, a man leaning against a light post, pretending to check his phone, a woman with a grocery bag slowing her pace a few feet away, a teenager standing nearby, hands stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, eyes flicking between Eddie and Vance. The city had a way of turning private moments into public spectacle. Vance looked back at Eddie. "What would you do with it?" Eddie let out something between a laugh and a scoff. "Ain't that the question?" But Vance didn't smile. He wasn't joking. Eddie's expression hardened just a little. "$1 don't get you much these days," he muttered. Maybe a coffee, maybe a piece of bread if you know where to go. A pause. Then, quieter, or maybe just a moment. Where I don't feel like nothing. The way he said it sat heavy in the air between them, not defensive, not begging, just true. Vance's jaw tightened as he glanced at Eddie's hands, still stuffed in his jacket pockets, fingers shifting as if trying to hold on to something invisible. You used to work? Vance asked. Eddie let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, before life got in the way. Vance gave a slight nod. What was the job? Eddie hesitated, then shrugged. Plumber. Not the fancy kind. Residential work, mostly. Fixed leaky pipes, replaced busted water heaters. He shook his head. Ain't much demand for a guy who don't got a fixed address, though. Vance didn't argue, he heard stories like this before. Some people fell through the cracks so fast they barely had time to brace for impact. Eddie rubbed his chin, his fingers brushing over the uneven stubble. So, you gonna give me $1 or what? Another pause. Vance's answer wasn't what anyone expected. I'll give you something better. Eddie's forehead creased. Man. I ain't asking for a sermon. It's not a sermon, Vance said. Eddie stared at him, weary, as the street noise seemed to quiet just a little, as if the city itself was waiting to see what would happen next. But whatever Vance had in mind, it wasn't going to be simple. Eddie squinted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He'd been here before. Conversations like this usually ended with some lecture about self-improvement, bootstraps, or personal responsibility. He braced himself for the same, but Vance didn't launch into a speech. Instead, he simply asked, when's the last time someone gave you a real shot? Eddie's brow furrowed. What, like a job? Like anything. The question caught him off guard. He blinked, then looked past Vance as if searching for an answer somewhere in the cityscape behind him. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Been a while. Vance nodded, as if he already knew. You ever try to get off the streets? Eddie shot him a look. Man, what kind of question is that? Vance didn't flinch. Eddie scoffed, rubbing the side of his face. You think I want to be out here? You think this is some kind of choice? Vance stayed quiet, letting him talk. I tried shelters, Eddie continued. Half of them full up before I even get in the door. Tried work, you know what they tell me? Come back when you got a phone, come back when you got an address. He let out a humorless chuckle. Like I could pull that out of thin air. Vance crossed his arms, listening. Eddie shook his head. You ever been homeless? No, Eddie smirked. Yeah, didn't think so. Vance tilted his head slightly. But I've been poor. Eddie looked at him differently now, still skeptical, but maybe a little less dismissive. Yeah? Vance nodded. Grew up in a house where sometimes the heat didn't work, where the fridge was mostly empty. I know what it's like to go to school wearing the same clothes 2-3 days in a row. Eddie sniffed, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. Yeah, well, bet you had a way out. Vance held his gaze. Took a while. A beat of silence stretched between them. Around them, the city moved on, but in that moment, neither of them did. The small crowd had grown, people lingered, watching. A man in a baseball cap held up his phone, pretending to check messages but clearly recording. A woman whispered something to her friend, her eyes flicking between Vance and Eddie. Eddie exhaled sharply. So what, you gonna sit here and tell me to pull myself up? That I just need to work harder? Vance shook his head. No, Eddie narrowed his eyes. Then what? Vance reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of money, he pulled out a small folded piece of paper and held it out. Eddie added suspiciously. What's that? A name. A number. Eddie didn't take it. What for? Someone who can help. Eddie gave him a look. Help how? They run a program. Housing first. No strings. Eddie scoffed. Yeah, right. Ain't that easy? Vance didn't lower his hand. No, it's not. But it's real. Eddie hesitated. He had been given empty promises before, handed flyers for shelters that were already full, numbers for programs with waiting lists months long. He wasn't sure if this was any different, but something about Vance's face, the way he wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to sell anything, made Eddie pause. Why are you doing this? Eddie asked. Vance's answer was simple. Because someone once did it for me. Eddie swallowed, his eyes darting between Vance and the paper in his hand, but he wasn't the only one watching, and not everyone agreed with what was happening. He stared at the folded paper like it was a loaded question. He had seen handouts before, flyers for soup kitchens, worn-out business cards from social workers who never answered their phones, crumpled pamphlets from churches offering prayers instead of solutions. But something about this moment felt different. Finally, he reached out and took the paper, though not without a skeptical glance. His rough fingers unfolded it, unsteady from the cold. The name written inside meant nothing to him. The number didn't either. It could have been real, or it could have been another dead end. He exhaled sharply through his nose. So that's it? He looked up at Vance. No dollar? A few people in the small crowd scoffed. Someone muttered under their breath. The man with the baseball cap adjusted his phone, still recording. Vance stayed calm. Would $1 really help, Eddie? Eddie let out a bitter chuckle. Wouldn't hurt. Wouldn't change anything either, Vance replied, holding his gaze. Eddie clenched his jaw. Man, I ain't asking you to save me. Just asked for a damn dollar. A scoff came from the crowd, and a woman off to the side shook her head, muttering, just give him the money, man. Vance ignored the voices, his focus locked on Eddie. You said you worked before, plumbing, right? Eddie exhaled hard. Yeah. What about it? Vance pulled out his phone. There's a guy I know, runs a contracting business out of Dayton. He's always looking for workers. He'll take a chance on people who need a second shot. Eddie squinted at him. You serious? Vance nodded. I make the call, you show up, you work, you get paid. No games. The crowd stirred. The teenager in the hoodie whispered something to his friend. A man near the curb, who had been watching silently, shook his head and muttered, politicians, man. Always a stunt. Eddie let out a dry laugh. So let me get this straight, I asked for $1, and you're trying to give me a job. Vance's expression didn't change. I'm trying to give you a way out. Eddie stared at him for a long moment, his grip tightening on the piece of paper. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, waiting to see what he'd say, waiting to see if he'd take the offer or tell Vance to go to hell. Someone in the crowd finally snapped. This some kind of joke? The voice came from a man in his 40s, standing near the curb with a canvas grocery bag slung over his arm, his face lined with skepticism, his mouth curled in disbelief. He didn't ask for a job interview. The man continued, he asked for a damn $1, a cup of coffee. You really think a dude living on the streets can just show up to a job like that? A few others murmured in agreement, but Vance didn't look away from Eddie. You tell me, he said. Eddie's mouth felt dry, his fingers twitching at his sides. He had been stuck in this life for so long he wasn't sure if he even knew how to want something different anymore. The paper in his hand felt like it was burning a hole through his skin, and then he did something no one expected. His fingers curled around it like he was holding something fragile, something he wasn't sure belonged to him. His breath felt heavy in his chest. A job. A real shot. Not $1, not a pity-filled pat on the shoulder, something bigger. And yet, the weight of all the eyes on him made his skin itch, the judgment rolling off the people nearby, the ones who weren't homeless, the ones who had homes to go back to, warm beds, lives that didn't involve asking for loose change. You gonna take it or what? The man with the grocery bag challenged, his voice sharp with something between disbelief and irritation. Eddie shot him a glare. What's it to you? Eddie snapped. The man scoffed, shifting the weight of his bag. What's it to me? I've seen guys like you 100 times, always an excuse, always a reason why something ain't good enough. Eddie's jaw clenched. Man, you don't know a damn thing about me. The guy let out a dry laugh. I know you ain't worked in years, I know you're out here begging instead of trying, and I know you ain't about to take that offer. He shook his head. And if you do, you'll quit the second it gets hard. The words hit harder than Eddie wanted to admit, his grip on the paper tightening. He wanted to tell the guy to shove it, to say he didn't know what the hell he was talking about, but the truth was, a small part of Eddie wondered if he still had it in him, if he could wake up at 5 in the morning, push through the exhaustion, show up, and prove himself. And then there was the other side of it, the one that whispered, what if this is just another lie? He turned back to Vance, his eyes filled with something unreadable. And what happens if this is bullshit? If I show up and they ain't got nothing for me? Vance didn't blink. Then you call me. Eddie narrowed his eyes. His eyes flickered. Call you? Vance nodded, holding up his phone. I don't give people my number lightly, but if you show up and they don't give you work, you call me, and I'll find you something else. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. The teenager in the hoodie whispered, Yo, is this real? To his friend, while the man with the grocery bag scoffed, but said nothing else. Eddie's heart pounded in his chest. It was too much, too real. He had spent so much time expecting people to ignore him, avoid his gaze, pretend he didn't exist, but now, all of this? A job, a lifeline? It scared the hell out of him. He swallowed hard. I don't even got a phone. Vance didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black burner phone, holding it out. Now you do. The crowd went dead silent. A few gasps. Someone muttered, No way. Eddie stared at the phone like it was a foreign object, his breathing uneven. No one had ever done something like this for him before. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, a voice from the crowd cut through the air like a blade. This is all for show. Eddie's grip on the phone tightened, his heart hammering. Eddie, whose heart had been pounding with something close to hope, clenched his jaw at the accusation. The man who had spoken was older, mid-50s, maybe, with a salt and pepper beard and a flannel shirt worn thin. He looked at Vance, arms crossed, face hard. This some kind of political stunt? His voice dripped with suspicion. Cameras are rolling, people watching, and suddenly you're out here saving a homeless man. What happens when they stop watching? Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodded in agreement, others looked uncertain. Vance met the man's stare without flinching. You think I did this for attention? The man scoffed. Ain't that what politicians do? Eddie glanced between them, something twisting in his gut. He didn't want to believe that's what this was. He didn't want to think he was just another pawn in someone else's story. But that doubt, so familiar, so deeply ingrained, crept back in, threatening to smother whatever spark had been lit. Vance, however, didn't raise his voice. He had something other than the weight of survival pressing down on him. Vance hadn't relied on flashy words or hollow promises. He had simply said, what I did today doesn't change just because people are watching. If you think it does, that says more about the world you've seen than it does about me. The man in the flannel had no response for that. He just shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and walked off. A woman in the crowd spoke next. So what happens now? The question hit Eddie harder than expected because, for the first time in a long time, the answer was actually his to decide. He blinked, realizing everyone was waiting for him to speak. He had the phone. He had the number. He had the chance. But was he really going to take it? He licked his lips, glanced at the burner phone once more, then stuffed it into his pocket. Guess I make a call, he muttered. It was the smallest commitment he could make, just a call, just a first step. Vance nodded. That's all you gotta do. Eddie shifted his weight. And if I screw it up? Vance didn't hesitate. You try again. Eddie let out a slow breath. He didn't know if this would change his life, if this was another false hope or the real thing. But for the first time in a long time, he had something more than just the streets waiting for him. He had something, a name, a number, a phone, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. Vance stepped back, giving him space, no pressure, no theatrics, just a simple truth left hanging in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera clicked off. A few people walked away shaking their heads, still debating whether what they had just witnessed was real or not. But for Eddie, it didn't matter what they thought. This wasn't about them. It was about whether or not he was ready to fight for himself again. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked away, this time with something in his pocket that wasn't just another empty promise. Not every opportunity comes in the form we expect. Some don't come at all. But when they do, when someone reaches out and says, "I see you," the hardest part isn't taking the help, it's believing you deserve it. Maybe Eddie makes that call, maybe he doesn't. But the lesson here isn't about a guaranteed outcome, it's about what happens when we stop assuming people are beyond saving and start treating them like they still matter. If this story made you think, share it, you never know who might need to hear it today. And if you've ever had a second chance, drop a comment below, because sometimes, knowing someone else made it through is all the hope a person needs. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.